Well, good afternoon, everyone. I do have you on mute, but we've got, I think, about 12 people coming in to this meeting or have registered for this meeting. My name is Jackie Vanderveld. I'm a board member of Wellbeing Australia and one of the organising committee for the Veteran Wellbeing Summit. It's a little bit different from our normal webinars because we wanted to make this one a bit more interactive. So we will be allowing you to unmute and share your cameras, turn your video on so that you can say hello and ask questions as we go along. But before I get started, just wanted to let you know about Wellbeing Australia. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We're actively involved in collaborations where we're encouraging Australians to be self-agents with their own wellbeing. And the summit was based on the foundation, on the ideals of action, hope and transformation. And in these presentations across 3 weeks this year, we're going to be, gathering stories and people who have success in building up veteran wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention. So we do have the chat box that we're going to use today for questions. I thought that initially what we might do is I'll take you through some of the data and pause at points. And if you do want to say something, there is the ability to put your hand up and ask a question. We can enter into some discussion as well. We are recording, but I will make sure that the discussion part that we have that identifies you will be taken out of the recording that we then post online as the curated event. So just to give you a bit of background and a bit more idea of what we were doing last year, if you hadn't been part of it, we came together with a group of partners with a very limited budget and put on quite a substantial 4-week program. And you have to excuse, I've got a very enthusiastic puppy. Everyone's working from home here today, so the dog's running around between people. But we were very fortunate to have the support of South Lake Macquarie RSL sub-branch. We've got the president is actually on this call at the moment, and we supported them by Codex Digital and the Resilience Centre around some of the digital presence that we have with the summit. So success, and we did measure our success, in that we reached 11,500 people, 10,000 over the 4 weeks that we ran the summit, and then another 1,500 people. These are unique hits and engagement with the work that we did, including Veterans Health Week in the October-November period last year. So our data sources to get this information, we had quite a number of data sources. Obviously, click rates and mail outs, the subscribers to the website. Social media analysis, we took that was weighted slightly less. I know that a lot of other organisations place a lot more weight on social media analysis, but we didn't in this case. Where we took most of our data was around the impact survey data and the registrations and attendance, those interactions with both the synchronous and asynchronous activities that we ran. And we also did some mapping on IP addresses where people had logged in from. If you know anything about statistics, our impact survey data, if we have a population of 10,000 people, we really wanted to have a confidence level of 95%. And I pulled the margin of error down from 5% to 3%. And that required us to have a sample size of, of around 370. Well, we got a much higher sample rate than that. As you can see there, we got close to, we actually got, 1,250. So that really did mean that our confidence level margins of error were well and truly reached. Based on that information, we had 74% of the population identified as being veterans, and then we had families of veterans ESO and service providers and other. And the other there was mainly people that worked in allied health services and also research, who specifically engaged in research around veterans' wellbeing and veteran health issues. At the end of November, this is where we were at. We're obviously substantially higher than that. We've had people accessing the curated website now for some months, and we're significantly higher than that. But we have not been tracking that data much beyond the November period as we got into Christmas. Looking at where people were from, this is where what our heat map actually gave us. So we're not surprised by any of this. We know that veterans do live in the bigger population areas, and we did actually get significant hits and significant engagement from all over the country. There are some other smaller hits in some of the regional areas, but as you can see, we're sort of following those general population areas as well. And no surprises there with Darwin and Townsville being garrison towns. We would expect to see population centres there engaging with the Veteran Wellbeing Summit. So just generally, and I'll just go through some of these feedback stats for you, then we'll get into what was working. But people generally found that the sessions were informative, and bearing in mind these were select in, so people were looking at the program and selecting the options that they wanted to go to, so they weren't having to sit through programs or webinars that they weren't particularly interested in. They found it was thought-provoking, and what we wanted to do was not just say, were they happy with it, did they like it? We wanted to know whether or not there was some sort of impact. So what was the change in thinking? Were people starting to think more about their wellbeing as a result of having participated in one of the events? So we actually had quite a good strong feedback on that we were actually reaching people, and getting that change in thought process happening. And then, in terms of whether they attended or watched, whether they watched on demand, were they useful, very useful, or extremely useful? We rated very highly there. And then in terms of motivation post the session, there was feedback that they were, 89% of them say they were most likely to actually were motivated to find out more. And we've got evidence now coming in from the hits on post summit last year, the number of people actually going back and having a look at multiple times some of the presentations as well. And we've got our presenters have also been reporting that they're getting increased traffic to their websites, and also inquiries based on having had a presentation at the summit. So when we benchmarked our webinars against other similar online health events, we're the blue line, coming out against some of that global benchmarking. So we were punching above our weight in terms of impact there. And then, certainly the feedback was that they wanted more webinar sessions, but also to have the opportunity to have small interactive groups as well. And then obviously they were motivated a great deal to be proactive about their own wellbeing. So we classed that as a bit of a win. And then in the qualitative feedback, the things that were that came back in the open comments were the fact that it was veteran centric, that people were actually giving their personal stories and their personal stories of success, and there are quite a number of those. The accessibility, having it online, having it on demand, being able to, be anonymous in that sense too, that nobody really had to sort of declare who they were in a webinar necessarily. Having that wide selection of topics, and we didn't say no to too many things last year. We really were quite open, providing people met the criteria around action, hope and transformation. We were keen to have their stories told. The language was really accessible. Clearly there was a commitment and passion from the presenters, the ability to ask questions, and then obviously the recordings and having people being able to go back and view again and again as necessary, and also to share that too amongst their network. They found that really helpful. So what was impactful and how do we measure impact? We had to come up with an index for that. So the index, there's a fair bit of maths and modelling that went behind this, but we came up with an index that brought together the number of synchronous participations, asynchronous viewing, so viewing the recordings, and then the number of hits, views, downloads on the curated website, as well as the question and answers and the interactions that we had during a session, and the follow-up that happened from that. So we were contacted, and by follow-up we mean contact by veterans or people who had watched our sessions wanting to be connected with one of the providers or one of the presenters. We had quite a number of ex-service organisations and other service providers starting to work together on projects. So which was really part of our intention, was actually to connect up groups that had similar goals and perhaps different areas of expertise, but all working in the same direction. So that was incredibly useful, and some of those partnerships and working groups are continuing now, which is great to see. So we then applied that engagement and impact index to all of the presentations, and we ended up with this type of bubble graph arrangement that tells us in terms of a veteran engagement score and a family support or support network engagement score, and then based on the number of engagement and impact, or how much the engagement and impact survey then inflated the bubble. And you can see the larger the bubble, the greater the engagement and impact, and the positioning on the graph tells us whether or not it was something that was more appealing to veterans or more appealing to the family and support network. So we're particularly interested about what's going on in that bottom right-hand corner. And so we pulled a lot of that data apart, and I've just got to move a few things around on my screen. Excuse me, just a minute, I'm working off a laptop, so I've got real estate on the screen is a little bit, real estate on the screen is a bit tight. So down in that bottom right-hand corner, there were two main things that came out of the analysis. And this really shouldn't be much of a surprise for people. But veterans were seeking skills and techniques for veterans to learn more about managing and nurturing their own wellbeing, mental health and physical health. And the partners and families and support networks were seeking the same thing, but also, so how they were going to support the veteran, but also to how they were going to support their own wellbeing and mental health and that of their family. So that was the additional piece. So we've taken a lot of that on board for this year and what we're going to be running. But I thought it was useful now to start to drill down into some of that content. And I'd like to pause at this point and ask if anybody here has any questions, if they'd like to share anything. Speak now. Participants, I'm going to start unmuting people. So if you'd like to say something, unmute yourself. Are there any questions at this stage? No? Good to keep going? We'll keep going. Hope you're all still awake. Oh, I've got one new message. Okay, thanks, Pre. Thank you. It's always good to know that people are awake. It's hard to tell when you can't see everyone. Okay, so sharing again where we're at with that, that bottom right-hand bubble. And there's quite a list of different sorts of things that were going on with those presentations. So when we looked at the, oh, I've got another question. Oh, great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Peter. Thank you. Good to hear. Okay, so a number of things going on in that bottom right-hand corner that I think is useful for those of you who are, if you're working as ESO or other service providers, it's good for you to understand this because it might certainly or hopefully will inform the sort of work that you do. And if there's anything that happens that I speak about here that you're interested in discussing further on a one-to-one context about how it might impact on the work that you're doing, I'm very happy for people to contact me to set up a time to discuss it, because I think the more we work together, the better outcomes we can certainly achieve. So working on what works was certainly the key theme for the entire summit. And the sessions, as a rule, did not spend time talking about the problems. Everybody knows what isn't working. We also wanted to make sure that we separated, put the politics out of this as much as we possibly could. And that's a pretty big ask, I know, but we did manage to do that quite well. Having said that, you know, we did sort of speak to policy, where we felt that, you know, particular policy issues needed to be addressed. We did also, you know, from the summit actually make representation on a number of different issues that were raised, particularly around assistance animals. We were actually able to provide quite a bit of information to government about the way the assistance animal sector was actually moving, and the sorts of things that they might like to consider in terms of their, you know, their policy and legislation there. But as a rule, we tried to keep that aside. And we know that there are certainly matters of justice, okay, that need to be investigated and dealt with. And certainly we've heard a lot about that in terms of calls for a Royal Commission. But in the meantime, we really believe that veterans, their partners and families have got a right to live their best life now. And so we were very intentional about talking about what's working, how it's working, and the evidence of that impact and the gains that are being made. So a couple of things that came from that, being intentional in this way confirmed for our participants, so the people that viewed the sessions or participated in the sessions, that exploring the past really did lead to blame. And one of our goals is about developing responsibility for the future. And so when we spoke to the presenters last year in their preparation, we really did ask them to look at ways that their programs were exploring problem-free futures. You'll say that quickly, problem-free futures, so that they didn't have to dwell on the past or even understand some of the things that perhaps happened to them in the past. Now that kind of flies in the face of, you know, veterans who are perhaps, you know, going down the claims and the claims path with DVA, where you do actually have to find out what's wrong with you so that you can actually get the, you know, get the pension claims in. But in terms of a psychological point of view and a wellbeing point of view, you can actually have two parts of the conversation. So yes, go down the claims path, but then also to be starting to explore some of these problem-free futures, so that you can move on with your life. One of the things that became really clear from the presenters who had huge engagement and were obviously able to speak to the success of their programs was that a diagnosis doesn't necessarily determine the future. So even for veterans who have really severe injury and incapacity, there's still a future to be explored, planned for, actioned and then lived. And that was really clear that there were, you know, people that had been through, and I think, you know, in this group here, just, you know, and you would all know people, and we all know people who've gone through pretty rough and awful times and have been left, you know, according to society, by all measures, pretty broken. But where these programs were having success, or where these individuals who are working with the veterans were having huge success, was saying, drawing that line in the sand and saying there is a problem-free future for you to explore, even with those, you know, severe injuries and incapacity. The other thing that was really interesting is that when they were talking about change, you know, and we are, you know, and in the wellbeing space, if you want to be improving wellbeing, then you're actually talking about, you know, quite, you know, a path of change. Which can be frightening and challenging. But what they were able to do was to actually recognise that even small change, even a small shift, was hugely important and hugely significant for the individual. So their programs are really focusing on, or their methodology was really focusing on being able to recognise the shift and the change in the right direction. And then working with the individual, working with the veteran to recognise that change for themselves. And that benefit was huge. And they were finding that once they were able to do that, they're actually building agency and capacity of the individual then to be able to take up a path of wellbeing, a program of wellbeing, largely unassisted. Once they got used to recognising those small changes and celebrating the small changes for themselves. Hearing what the veteran had to say about what works for them and their wellbeing was essential. So I think that there's certainly a lot of talk and there's certainly a perception that when a veteran in need comes to an organisation, whether it be an ex-service organisation or some other service provider or health provider, that they are there to be fixed. And I think too, as providers, sometimes, and not that I'm necessarily working in veteran health at all, other than this work, but certainly, the jobs of ex-service organisations and some of the health providers and allied health and occupational health providers in the veteran space do, because we are time poor, would be thinking, oh, I'm the expert and I've got to fix everything. But in actual fact, the people who were working in this space that were actually engaging in some sort of co-design with the veteran were having greater success. And I think that, we're certainly seeing a lot more evidence of that in some of the academic research as well. So building on that last point, the most successful programs, interventions and actions were where the people who were running it took a bit of a not knowing stance, and they were putting their expertise on hold for a little bit and encouraging the veterans to be the experts in what they need. So the whole judgment equation, was really taken out of that relationship. So veterans felt they weren't being judged. They felt immediately there was greater rapport. Yes, it is, Peter, I haven't moved it. That's right, it is on one slide. The veteran felt that there was instant rapport with the provider, and they were in a position then where they could actually start to build an intervention or build a program that was actually going to work so much better for them. So identifying what's going right rather than what's going wrong was certainly a big part of the success as well. So working on those solutions rather than assisting the veteran to find those solutions was a very key part to success. And what we found from speaking with actually from the feedback that we received from the veterans who participated, but also too from the people who presented, was that when you have solutions that are co-designed and primarily led by the veteran, then they were more likely to be meaningful, achievable and successful. So we know that imposing what works for others doesn't always work for the individual. So sometimes the failure was occurring where they had large-scale programs that did not allow it. So this has worked for us in the past, it'll work for us in the future. And in fact, what they were missing was that, the population of veterans and their needs had actually changed. And this is probably where we're seeing that disconnect happening between programs that have perhaps worked for older veterans are not working for the younger ones. And so you've got that disconnect from the younger veterans from some of the programs that had traditionally worked. So I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that the concept of co-design, it might seem like a lot of extra work and it might be something that's a little bit different, but it is certainly working well where it is being implemented. Increasing choices in programs certainly and treatment plans enables that agency to develop and that behavioural change. And where we had goals being more specific, or more specifically outcomes, need to be meaningful for the veteran. okay, in order for them to be successful. But, you know, the corollary of that too is that they also need to be legal and moral, okay? So you can't be having them going off doing things that are just not going to necessarily be helpful in that regard. I hope that's been a useful discussion for you, and that helps with perhaps as a bit of a checklist for the sorts of things that might inform the practices that you're engaging with yourselves. Some other points that I think are really worth noting, that in terms of the content of discussion that came out from last year, anything that works on improving identity and purpose, that's still a huge issue for people. Even though I think some of our vets who were on these, participated in some of these sessions last year, were, you know, for many years out of service, you know, sort of 20 more years out of service, they still were struggling with some of those issues around identity and purpose. And finding a new tribe or connecting with the ex-ADF tribe was something that was really important to them. And having, you know, varying success, you know, in doing that. Online provided, it's not the solution. I think it's part of the solution. It's part of the puzzle, you know, bringing perhaps sessions like this online. But it did provide a soft landing into reconnecting, and it breached that isolation. So remembering too that isolation just isn't that physical or geographical isolation, but it's also that disconnect that people feel. I mean, we had lots of people who were calling in and participating from, you know, from big population centres, who were just as isolated and felt just as disconnected. The discussions that they participated in last year helped to take those first steps to get them, you know, reconnected with their tribe. So the two things that are going on here around success, and success was happening when those individuals became agents for their own wellbeing, and secondly, when they were given permission to be the agents for their own wellbeing. I think there's two different things. It's only a subtlety in language, but it really is quite profound. So we've got, you know, individuals being their own agents and also being given permission to be agents for their own wellbeing. So, you know, in the work that you're doing, you know, listening to them, hearing them, getting them to say this, you know, talk about the sorts of things that they want to see in their problem-free future, are really critical to setting some of those goals and outcomes that you can both work, you know, you and the organisation along with the veteran can work towards. So that's the learning so far that we've got. I really hope that's been useful, and we'll certainly, obviously this recording, and I'll take our discussion at the end just to protect your privacy as well. I'm quite happy to have that. I'll cut that out in the curated part of the recording. But does anyone have any final comments that they'd like to make before we break for the afternoon? Thanks so much, everyone. It's
thank you.
Lovely to have you online.
Really wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for participating.
Bye.
Bye.